Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our midweek COVID update of Wednesday, 26th of January. It really looks now that we are nearing the end of our Omicron-driven fourth wave. We're coming pretty close. If you hadn't reached it already, an arbitrary cutoff of 5 new cases on the 7-day average of new cases per 100,000 population. So just let's see how it looks. But it really is looking pretty good in terms of coming to the end of our fourth wave. Right, as you can see, the curve is coming all the way down, probably pretty close to the baseline now. You're now becoming familiar with it. And also you can see, in fact, how the cases have progressively increased in terms of numbers, but not the hospitalization and not the death as well. So highly contagious, very widespread infection, but relatively low in terms of hospital admissions, in terms of severe cases. Now, if you look at the what's called the reproductive rate, the R number, I've dealt with this a number of times. In other words, the number of infected individuals who are infected from an infectious person. And it's got, and this R number has gone well below 1. 1 means that one infectious person infecting one susceptible person. Below 1, of course, the epidemic then starts coming down. There's still the stragglers, the grumbling on. It hasn't totally disappeared. This is the NICD dashboard. You can see that between 2,000 and 3,000 cases per day, 23 deaths, unfortunately, per day. So there's a low level of activity, which is still persisting. In the Jewish community, the Hatzolah data, still the last week, there were 32 new cases. We still have 88 active cases on the Hatzolah home monitoring program. So again, it's sort of a kind of a grumbling, low level onward activity. On the vaccine front, not very much to report, I'm afraid. We're still not doing great. We still got this wide gap, even between the global average of 50%, our adult population fully vaccinated, 42.21%. So still pretty low. But many people are looking at Omicron and saying, is this a friend or a foe? It's obviously a foe in terms of the disease that it has caused, but is it potentially, and underline the word potentially, the harbinger, the kind of gateway to the end of the pandemic? So people are now talking about endemic COVID now to replace the pandemic of COVID. And a lot of people are looking at Omicron as a sign that this is happening. So this is really what I want to deal with mainly in today's presentation. Are we heading towards the end of the pandemic, and what's the evidence for it? What's the evidence against it? So let me come back to this graph and to really kind of define, what do we mean by endemic, what do we mean by epidemic, and what do we mean by pandemic? I think we need to get these concepts quite clear. This magic level of 1, this line over here, is really what defines it. If the outbreak, the number of cases sustainably, and I'm underlying bold, sustainably, is below the 1 level, then we call it endemic. In other words, the virus or the infectious agent is present at a low level and is not expanding. Doesn't mean that necessarily that it's a mild infection. You know, things like, for example, hepatitis B is endemic. We can even say HIV may be endemic by definition. So these are, but endemic really defines the actual spread of the infectious disease. Once it goes above the 1 level, that's in its epidemic phase. It's expanding at various degrees of rapidity into the population. That's epidemic. The difference between epidemic, let me get the other pointer probably a bit better. The difference between epidemic and pandemic is really geographical. Epidemic really defines an outbreak or spreading of infection, either within a country or in a country, and pandemic means it's global or in many countries throughout the world. It's just the degree, the geographical degree. So let's come back to the endemic coronaviruses. Now, we've had 4 endemic coronaviruses for millennia. These are entrenched, these are human viruses entrenched in the human population, causing mild illness, the common cold, mild upper respiratory infection, mild gastrointestinal infection, upset tummies. Usually something we can tolerate. We haven't really been too concerned with it. As I said, when I was lecturing undergraduate students, these 4 coronaviruses, these 4 poor little coronaviruses, occupied about 20 seconds or maybe 30 seconds of lecturing time. They were not really considered very significant. Then we have the coronavirus, which came from the animal kingdom, what we call zoonotic zoo animals. Bats being the main reservoir of these viruses. And these have entered into the human population, either directly or via an intermediate animal host and then into humans, causing in 2003 the first severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS-CoV-1, then MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome in 2012, and now 2019 onwards, SARS-CoV-2. Now these coming in from a foreign source into humans have caused severe respiratory and also systemic, in other words, the rest of the body infection. Now, what we're hoping that now SARS-CoV-2 has been with us for 2 years, that is now will become, or hopefully will become, a human virus, in other words, an endemic virus. And in fact, join its 4 friends over here to become the 5th human endemic coronavirus. That's the hope. And I said last week, I'll tell you the lovely story about the Australian rabbit population explosion and the story of myxomatosis, a long name for a viral infection. The story of myxomatosis in rabbits in Australia started in 1788. Rabbits are introduced into the Australian population as a food source by the English settlers. And as will happen when you introduce a foreign species, an alien species, this has been done over and over again, they explode, as you can see from this picture over here, taken many years back in one of the islands off the Australian coast. So in 1937, they thought they'd do this biological control by introducing a virus called the myxoma virus. It's a virus, there's an electron micrograph of it. It's a virus which is related to the human smallpox virus. And this virus was very, very lethal, just under 100% lethal to rabbits. And it in fact decimated the rabbit population, but many rabbits still survived. And in fact, they started breeding. And as a result, this was really a result of what we call co-evolution. Both the host became resistant genetically, and also the virus increased its transmissibility, its infectiousness, and became less virulent, not nearly like this. And as a result, these rabbits then started taking over. And if you look at this co-evolution, the increase of transmissibility, increased infectiousness, and reduced virulence, reduced amount of severe disease, and at the same time, the host becomes more resistant. This is what some people are hoping is happening now with coronavirus. There certainly is ample evidence that Omicron is reducing its virulence. This has been shown, I think I mentioned it last week, in laboratory studies, and of course in clinical observations as well. And also the host is increasing its resistance, not by genetic breeding, but by immunology, by developing host immunity, either vaccine-induced or from natural immunity. So, are we on the road to endemicity? Well, it's not quite as simple as that. It is a bit more complex. There are positive features, which are in green, and then negative features in red. Positive features are viral fitness, population immunity, and next generation of vaccines. So let me deal with them briefly. What we mean by viral fitness is a combination of the infectiousness of the virus and its ability to escape the immune system, either from infection or vaccine-induced immunity. And this is really what's happened if you look at coronavirus. We had our first wave due to the ancestral strain, the D614G. This was then replaced, was elbowed out by a more fit virus, a virus which is able to replicate in the population because it's more transmissible and evades the immune system. That was the beta variant, which caused the second wave. that elbowed out the D614G, the original variant. And then we had the Delta variant, which became even more fit. It was more contagious, more able to evade the immune system, and that then elbowed out the Beta variant. And now we have the Omicron, sorry, it's a bit cut off, the Omicron variant, which has elbowed out the Delta variant to become the dominant strain because it is more fit, it is more contagious, and it is more able to evade the immune system. And so we have the cycle going on. So now we have to postulate something which is going to be even more fit than Omicron. That's quite a tall order. Now, Delta was quite a Superman when it happened, and Omicron was able to elbow it out. We have to now postulate, if we're going to have further waves, that we can have a variant which is going to be able to elbow out Omicron, or at best, coexist with Omicron. That's a positive feature. A second thing is a population immunity, and we've seen in previous presentations how our population immunity, either from recovery from infection, what you call natural immunity, or vaccine-induced immunity, or a combination of the two, is very high in South Africa. I showed you this graph before. As far back as September, we can see that in samples from the population, we had immunity topping 70%, now even maybe 80% of the population having intrinsic immunity, either from recovery from infection, natural immunity, or vaccine, or the combination of the two. It's a second positive feature. And then a third one is the development of next generation vaccines. I won't go into this, but obviously the hope is that the development of next generation, many of which are undergoing clinical trials now, will improve our ability to induce durable vaccine-induced immunity. So those are the positive things we tend to look on the more optimistic side, that we are coming to the end of the pandemic. But there are a lot of negatives as well. New variants, and I'll come to that just now. The waning of immunity, unfortunately, both natural immunity as well as vaccine-induced immunity doesn't appear to be all that durable. After about 4 months, 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, it tends to wane, to decrease, may necessitate regular boosting of the vaccine. That's a negative. And then, of course, human behavior. People are getting tired. How long can they maintain all these infection prevention measures? That's also negative. But let me now come back to the new variants. We saw that Omicron, in fact, is a completely new variant. It's not an offshoot. It's not an evolutionary offshoot of any of the previous variants of concern, the alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. It came completely unpredictable. And this is one of the big question marks. In fact, will a new variant also come completely on its own, unrelated to any of the variants, in other words, being completely unpredictable? And also, there's a possibility that Omicron might develop a variant which may be more fit than the original Omicron. And in fact, we are now seeing, in fact, that Omicron has now developed subvariants. There are BA1, which is the main one which we had, and then BA2. And BA2 seems to be overtaking BA1 subvariant of Omicron in many other countries, such as in India and Denmark and Singapore, became more than 50% of the subvariants of Omicron. So again, this is an unpredictable. Will we have a completely new variant? Will we have evolution of Omicron to become a more formidable foe? And unfortunately, we still have large parts of the world which are very poorly vaccinated, where the virus can continually replicate and develop new variants, and also people who are immunocompromised, who fail to clear the virus. And again, there's selective pressure. These are people either with advanced HIV or people on treatment for chronic infections, cancer, and so on. Yeah, the virus can remain, and by selective pressure, develop new variants. So that is, again, a remaining problem. So we see that the road to endemicity is not totally clear. There are some positive signs, and there are equally some negative signs. And at this stage, we really got to be very, very cautiously, and I stress cautiously, optimistic that maybe we're coming to the end of the pandemic. But I don't think there's any respectable scientist in the world who'd be brave enough to say that Omicron is the sign that we're coming to the end. I think we really have to wait and see. And I'll end off with this lovely quote from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. It's a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. And at the moment, the facts are not quite there to theorize. And I'll end off with this cartoon. Is Omicron the exit? Well, we don't know. We just don't know at this stage. So I'll leave it there, and I'll just come on to a couple of the questions which you sent in. Thank you very much. I must apologize. I missed one question which came up, which was sent in for last week's update, and that's the issue about the second dose for Johnson & Johnson. It's widely been originally we thought Johnson & Johnson was a single dose vaccine, but I think most people now around the world, including the people, including Johnson & Johnson themselves and the scientists associated with them, are now coming to the view that Johnson & Johnson is actually a two-dose vaccine, not a one-dose vaccine. And ideally, it should be given at least from 2 months onwards. But if it's given 6 months, also ideal. In fact, you get a very good immune response if it's given up to 6 months. But we are advocating a second dose of Johnson & Johnson 2 months after the first one. Then a related question, if one has Omicron infection, how long after recovery should one get vaccinated? And we say at least a month, 30 days after recovery from Omicron to get the vaccine. For a couple of reasons. It gives, first of all, there's a good immunity after recovery, particularly in that phase. And we're also going to get a very good immune response if we give a little bit of a gap between recovery and getting the vaccine. This question asks, when can they get their second dose of Pfizer? Of course, there's and it's not the second dose, I think it was the second dose of Pfizer or the booster, in fact. And we'd like that 6-month interval between the doses or the booster. So whichever comes first, either the 1 month after recovery or the 6-month interval between doses. And then lastly, a question about this vaccine called Novavax. Now, Novavax, when it was actually evaluated also in clinical trials in South Africa, was a very promising vaccine. It's a very good vaccine. It's made in a different way to either the Johnson & Johnson, which uses an adenovector, or the Pfizer, which is the messenger RNA vaccine. This is what's called a subunit vaccine. They take the spike protein and they make nanoparticles out of it, and they add a stimulant to what's called an adjuvant to stimulate the immune system, and it has been given very good results, and we'd like to use Novavax. The problem is that the manufacturing facility had production problems, and globally there's a dire shortage of Novavax. It wasn't used very widely at all, and in fact it's still one of the lesser used vaccines. With regard to us in South Africa, well, first of all, it's not a great need. We've got ample supplies of vaccines. The problem is getting people to be vaccinated. So that's not the question. So we don't need really another vaccine. We've got ample Pfizer and we've got a reasonable supply of Johnson & Johnson. So we don't need one. But neither of them, Novavax didn't apply for registration for a long time. They have now only initiated the application to SAPRA. So it is being evaluated. But that's the problem with Novavax. And also the supply of Novavax is not the actual streaming of the vaccine is not really very good at the moment. They do seem to have production problems in producing adequate amounts. But it is a good vaccine, and maybe it's something which can be considered in the future. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll end it there. All the best.